I just did a Facebook Live in Hindi on why Remember Lenin today, and today is the 150th birth anniversary of Lenin and his 151st birthday. And it's also the Party Foundation Day of CPIML, our party, my party. So I did a Facebook Live in Hindi, and I want to just briefly recap some of the main points that I raised in that in English as well, for those who need it in English. And what I did was to briefly say that why 150 years after somebody's birth, why remember Lenin? That too in India. I mean, he was born in Russia. We are born in India. What does his legacy have to offer us in India today? One of the things is that Lenin is best remembered as one of the foremost architects of the Russian Revolution, which won bread, land, and peace for the people of Russia. And what was the Russian Revolution? It was not a coup. It was a freedom struggle. The people of Russia, its workers, its peasants, its rank and file soldiers, its oppressed nationalities, they all rose up to free themselves from a czarist autocracy and assert their right to rule themselves. They demanded an end to India's involvement in World War I. And the people demanded bread, the peasants demanded land, and the women and soldiers led the demand for peace. And it's difficult to underestimate how important and how crucial this was, because at that time Russia was an extremely backward country. It was under the Tsarist rule, where democracy was non-existent, and Lenin is known as the leader of that revolution in 1917. So the first phase of that revolution happened in 1917 March, and then in October, or what we would today call November. So that revolution took place, and between March and November, in March what had happened was that the Tsarist regime fell, and it was replaced by a provisional government. But even the left did not take power in that government. The left supported that government, but did not lead it. It was led by certain bourgeois forces, and the reason was because the left felt that no, this is not a time for this is too premature for us to take power, because we can't do a socialist revolution yet. We should just do a democratic revolution only now, because we feel that maybe and democratic revolution means that it has to be led by the bourgeoisie. So under this misconception, the leftists had not taken power. But between March and November, things moved very fast, and the demand rose from the people that the Soviets should take power. And the Soviets were people's organizations, local committees of people or common people, which were there in workers' Soviets, peasant Soviets, and so on. They were there all over Russia, and the people demanded that the Soviets take power. So I just read out one little phrase to tell you what kind of thing the Russian Revolution was, because I also noticed that somebody was saying that, oh, it was violent and so on. So I just wanted you to understand that it was no conspiracy, it was no coup. In fact, the left at that time, including Lenin's own Bolshevik party as well as the Menshevik party, were hesitant to take power. And in July 1917, when postal workers and other workers came out, and soldiers came out in the streets in huge numbers to protest, demanding all power to the Soviets on 17 July, the Soviet leadership, which was hesitant to take power, and they felt that no, it's premature, they sent out one of their most popular and well-liked leaders, Chernov, to speak to the demonstrators and calm them down. And at that time, a big worker pushed his way through and came up close and shook his fist in Chernov's face, saying, "Take power, you son of a bitch." And when it's given to you. Take power when it's given to you. He shouted at them. And it was Lenin who had the sense at the right time to realize that no, this is a historic opportunity, and we can't just play things by the book here. This is an opportunity where we can probably give Russia the most strong democratic basis also, only if workers and peasants actually take power and we do a socialist revolution. That would probably be the only way in which to actually establish the most robust democracy as well. So that's what they did. So Lenin is known for this. And I had also mentioned that the importance of the fact that there was such a bread, land, and peace. Think about that, bread, land, and peace. So land the peasants wanted. Now peace, what was peace all about? The First World War was going on, and of course in Russia also there was a lot of ruling class sponsored nationalist sentiment, which was there even among the poor, even among the workers, which said that, oh, this is about Russian pride and Russia must win the war and so on and so forth. And the Bolshevik party of Lenin, which said that we are against the war under any circumstances, even if it means a defeat for Russia, Russia must pull out of the war. They were labeled as anti-national and so on and so forth. In fact, Putin gave a speech some years ago in which he said, look, I know you all like Lenin a lot, Lenin is still quite popular, but you have to know that these people were anti-Russia. They wanted Mother Russia to lose the First World War. The point is that the Bolshevik party stood firm by their internationalist position that they were against war. And they stood by it even when it was an unpopular position. And gradually, over a period of months, it became a popular position because Russian soldiers and their families did not want to participate in the war anymore. They became gradually more and more anti-war, and then it was the Bolshevik party which had the foresight to take that anti-war position and be firm by it, and so they gradually left the support they had for other left formations which were less, which were not anti-war or not so vocally anti-war, and they moved over to the Bolshevik party on account of this. So I had mentioned that. And I had also mentioned that this revolution was so remarkable because of the so many sections of people who participated in the in this movement. Let me just hook up my phone to a charger. Just a second. Yeah. Okay. Just a second while I just hook up the phone to a charger. Yeah, okay. So I had mentioned that the impact on Russia of this revolution was amazing, because every section of society, literally, there was no section of society which remained untouched by that revolution. So you found that women not only participated in very large numbers in the revolution, but women got rights and equality for the very first time, the right to abortion for the very first time, the right to divorce for the very first time. You had religious minorities like the Muslim minorities, for instance, who organized themselves into, they held conferences during that revolution. They invited left leaders to speak. They held conferences in which, believe it or not, Muslim women debated amongst themselves over what kind of personal laws they should have and whether there should be polygamy or not. These were things they debated in 1917 in Russia. And they were very much swept up with, and they were part of the revolution. Oppressed nationalities, and what were these nationalities? They were basically all the countries which have now become separate from Russia, which were once part of the Soviet Union and are now different, separate countries, right? That. So those were actually oppressed nationalities over which Tsarist Russia ruled, and those nationalities also participated in this revolutionary movement. They supported the revolution. They were very much part of it. One thing which very few people know is that LGBTQ persons got, they were also part of the revolution, and the Russian Revolution in 1917 did the remarkable thing to be probably one of the first countries in the world to decriminalize homosexuality, in so many words, and to come out very strongly in support of homosexual and transgender rights. In fact, transgender surgeries were first attempted in Soviet Russia around that time. Russia had leaders at that time. Revolutionary Russia had, their foreign minister was himself a gay man. And there was writing at that time by the Russian government as well as the Russian Soviet Party, the Bolshevik Party, the Communist Party at that time, which it reads so contemporary that it could be written yesterday. These are all part of our legacy that we need to reclaim. Much of this, yes, it was rolled back later in the day, as with other other parts of what was best in this revolution. And so Lenin is basically identified with what was, the November Revolution is remembered by the possibilities, the promises, the striving and the hope of the moment of its birth and its early years, when Lenin steered its ship into these new waters, into these uncharted waters. In the years that followed, many mistakes were made, and the initial promise foundered and was eventually reversed. But revolutionaries learned from these mistakes and missteps, and uh, they remember Lenin as the leader of that bold revolution of that time, and the hope and wish and will for that revolution cannot be drowned out by what happened to Soviet Russia later, or any criticism we have of Soviet Russia later, or even of China today. That was what I briefly mentioned. And then I had also briefly mentioned the fact that Bhagat Singh, Ashfaqullah, and many other revolutionaries were inspired by Lenin. In fact, Bhagat Singh and his comrades appeared in court on January 21st, 1930, wearing red scarves, raised the slogans of "Long live Socialist Revolution," "Long live Communist International," "Long live the people," "Lenin's name will never die," and "Down with imperialism." Bhagat Singh read out aloud in open court the text of a telegram to be sent to the Third International, on which they said, "On Lenin Day, we send hearty greetings to all those who are doing something for carrying forward the ideas of the great Lenin. We wish success to the great experiment Russia is carrying out. We join our voice to that of the international working class movement. The proletariat will win, capitalism will be defeated, death to imperialism." And not only those on the left, other Indians, for instance, Rabindranath Tagore also, who visited Russia in 1930, wrote in Russia Chithi, letters from Russia. Their message of the revolution is true for all the world. Here is a people on earth today who put the interests of all mankind above their own. And also, of course, there were others like S.A. Dange of Bombay, M. Shingaravelu of Madras, who were one of the earliest in the trade union movement and the left movement in India. They were all inspired by the Russian Revolution and by Lenin. So Lenin, remembering Lenin today is also to remember our own history, our own freedom struggle, and to read Lenin today, or to be inspired by the Russian Revolution today, is to remember that such a large part of our freedom fighters and India's anti-colonial struggle was inspired by revolutionary Russia and by Lenin. Okay. And this is especially important to remember when the BJP wants to demolish statues and say that Lenin statues. And we say, go right ahead and demolish whatever statues you like, because the more you demolish, the more people will want to know who was that person and what did he stand for. So, it will only provide greater opportunity for us to remember the role that, what Lenin means to us here in India and to people all over the world. I also briefly mentioned that reading Lenin today is sometimes, students and young people find it a little difficult. People may find it a little difficult because it was written, more than 100 years ago, whatever he was writing. So sometimes those debates seem a little abstruse and a little difficult to follow, because he is basically writing pamphlets. He is writing argumentative, polemical pamphlets with people he was arguing with then and there, right? So those people we don't know about. We sometimes don't know which parties he's talking about, which individuals he's talking about, which magazines he's talking about, which books he's talking about. And so sometimes the debate, it's a little difficult to follow. So what I want to do is to just give you a small sort of guideline about what you can read of Lenin's, and what may help put his writings in context. One of Lenin's best known works is What Is to Be Done, which was written in 1902. And what is to be done is basically Lenin's argument in support of forming a communist party. And a communist party in which he argued that you needed the communist party to be a vanguard of the working class. So not just a trade union, which is a sort of self-expression of the working class, in which the working class may spontaneously fight its struggles against its own, for wages and for its workers' rights and so on, against the, somebody is putting a couple of question marks. Is there no sound? Is there a problem with the sound? Dr. Naresh Patel, if there's a problem with the sound, just type it out here so that I know that there's a problem with the sound, yeah? And so, basically what is to be done was to do with his argument that it won't do just for workers to have trade unions and to imagine that workers can spontaneously become not just a class in themselves, but a class for themselves. That is, that they cannot recognize their revolutionary potential and their revolutionary role simply by fighting against those daily battles with their employers, right? So what did he mean by that? What was his argument? It is often understood as wrongly understood as an argument against. So there's a lot of talk nowadays which says, oh, this democratic centralism is primarily anti-democratic, and what is to be done, in which Lenin is arguing for a communist party. This idea of a vanguard party itself is something which is elitist and so on. But actually that's very far from the fact. What Lenin is saying there is something which is relevant not only to why you need a communist party and not just a trade union, which means, what is he saying there? He's saying that the relationship, he's saying exactly what Marx did, which is that Marx also had recognized that the relationship between, yeah, thanks, I realize the sound is good, so I'm going ahead. He realized that the relationship between workers and capitalists is not only an economic relationship. In fact, Marx said that when he described in that famous passage from Capital where he describes Mr. Moneybags and the worker who are doing an equal exchange in the free market, and then when they really go down into the depths of production, then the capitalist is striding ahead as the owner of capital, and the worker, the laborer, is behind him with nothing to sell but his own hide in the market, and nothing to expect but a hiding, that is a beating, right? So Marx also recognized that the relationship between the capitalist and the worker is a social relationship. It is a relationship of power. It is not only an economic relationship. And so naturally what Lenin is saying is that the struggle then has to be a political struggle. It has to be a struggle that is not economic alone. It may begin in the economic, but it has to go into every layer of the social and the political and be fought that way. And it's important to recognize this, that Lenin's contribution here, how important that was, because when Marx was writing, at that time basically the workers just had primarily one party, right? So it was one party, and Marx probably imagined that, well, that party will form trade unions, that party will organize workers, that party will be the revolutionary party. But over time the bourgeoisie also learned, and they also managed to find their own representatives to to establish their own parties within the working class. So Lenin had the job of helping workers to recognize the revolutionaries from the social democrats or the non-revolutionaries. Okay, he had that job. He had the job of fighting anarchists and arguing with the anarchists, and that he did. He also did okay, I'll come to that a little later, but I wanted to just talk about what is to be done here and just read out one passage which I'm very fond of mentioning as something which is useful to read. You probably don't know that even if you're interested in the feminist movement or the Dalit movement, or in how, what kind of relationship the left can have with various social movements of these kinds, and with the idea of social oppression and not just economic exploitation, even there you may like to pick up what is to be done, because in what is to be done, and this is something which when I take classes on this subject, even when I address international left students on this subject in Nepal, for instance, at a class, I tell them to keep this in their back pocket or put it on a poster on their door and show it to anybody who in the name of the left tries to tell them, as we women often know that people often do. They come and tell you, oh, this little feminist thing, women are dying of hunger and women are being raped by landlords, and so why are you talking about your hostel curfews or some such thing? This is a bourgeois demand. This can wait. So when somebody tries to tell you that you're right to dress as you like without slut shaming or victim blaming is something not revolutionary or something like that, please put them in their place by reading this passage out from Lenin to them, where Lenin says that the communist ideal, that the ideal communist should not be the trade union secretary, but the tribune of the people, who is able to react to every manifestation of tyranny and oppression, no matter where it appears, no matter what stratum or class of people it affects, who is able to generalize all these manifestations and produce a single picture of police violence and capitalist exploitation, who is able to take advantage of every event, however small, in order to set forth before all his socialist convictions and his democratic demands, in order to clarify for all and everyone the world historic significance of the struggle for the emancipation of the proletariat. What does Lenin mean here? Basically, what is he saying here? So he is basically saying that every bit of oppression, even if it is, the right to wear skirt or jeans without being slut shamed, whether it is even if it is a section, say it is somebody who is a Dalit bureaucrat or a woman bureaucrat, or who is otherwise seems to be economically better off but is being subjected to a social oppression, fighting for their rights, being their champion, being their tribune, is the very job definition of a communist. You cannot be a communist if you're not doing those things. You can't be a communist simply by being the trade union leader, the trade union, bureaucrat, basically. You can't do that. You can't even do that by being a good trade union leader alone. That is not good enough. And so that revolutionary teaching which the working class gets when it realizes that we are fighting not just for our own wages and our own rights, but we are fighting this revolutionary battle to overthrow capitalism, and that is a political battle, and we are fighting against a ruling class because we are a working class and we represent all the oppressed, and the ruling class is against our interests. That realization, for that realization to come, the workers have to be involved in political struggles, and all these social and political struggles are key and crucial to recognizing and realizing that. He also wrote Two Tactics of Social Democracy in 1905, which is something interesting to read because, again, it's a question of a tactical debate he's having within the in the two factions within the Communist Party, who had broken into two separate parties in 1904, 1 year before that. And then 1905 was a revolution was ongoing then, which was a dress rehearsal of sorts, a failed revolution, and yet it taught Russian revolutionaries a lot. And so in this, in Two Tactics, basically what he's arguing with the Mensheviks in the communist movement, and saying that, look, the Mensheviks were arguing that we need a democratic revolution, and a democratic revolution basically means that the working class and the peasantry must at some level accept the leadership of the bourgeoisie, that revolution, a democratic revolution against the czarist rule, that primarily has to be in collaboration with the bourgeoisie. What Lenin said was that which bourgeoisie? So he said, look, the people you're talking about, that bourgeoisie is not going to support you. That bourgeoisie, when push comes to shove, will make a compromise with the czarist rule because they are more afraid of you than they are of the czarist rule. So they want power, yes, but they are very afraid that if they let the working class lead this movement, then the working class will demand socialism and they will march on ahead to socialism, and so it won't do to do this. And so he is arguing this. It's in a way something like the arguments that the CPIML has today with the CPIM or the CPI in some senses. We can discuss that on some other date. But basically his argument is on those lines about who is going to lead this movement. And he is saying that when we talk about a bourgeois democratic force, who do we mean? We mean the peasantry. So he said that they are the democratic force, they're the democratic bourgeoisie who are willing to, who need a revolution to happen, and who are the natural allies of the working class, of the workers, of the industrial workers. So that's what Lenin was talking about in Two Tactics of Social Democracy. In 1916, he wrote Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. That again is something which is a sort of complementary to Marx's own analysis of capital. So in a way it should be read with Das Kapital, it should be read with Capital, because he's sort of updating the understanding to say that this is finance capital, and for finance capital, imperialism is crucial in order for capitalism's own survival. So that is the way in which capitalism is adapted to survive in new times. And it's also important because, from the point of view of India, he's writing about imperialism, and India at that time was ruled by colonial powers, and understanding how imperialism and colonialism work. To understand that, also reading this work is quite enlightening. There are also two works of Lenin's which are interesting to read in terms of the fact that he was debating with anarchists of his day. So State and Revolution 1917 and Left-Wing Communism in 1920. Left-wing communism and infantile disorder. About these, I'll just say only this much, that see, these arguments with anarchists, of course he was arguing, in left-wing communism he was persuading people in Europe who were inspired by the Russian Revolution, but who were anarchists, and he was telling them, look, it's childish to imagine that you can be some kind of, that you can be pure, that you can say that, oh, we are revolutionaries, so we won't participate in parliamentary elections. We are revolutionaries, and so we won't ever participate in elections. We won't participate in non-revolutionary trade unions and so on. And he said that, no, what do you think? This is not how things happen. Even in Russia, we did participate in elections in 1905. We did not, we boycotted elections in 1905, but we participated in elections subsequently. And he even gave the example of the fact that, look, if you're talking about, he said this famous thing about parliament is a pigsty, right? So he said there this famous thing where he said, look, we participated in that pigsty. And in the Duma, the person who was the leader of the revolutionary group in the Duma, the Bolshevik party in the Duma, turned out to be a police agent. But he said that that was a risk we had to take, and although because of that police agent we probably lost many lives, he probably helped to kill many of our comrades, but on the other hand, because he had to play his role in our party, and people who were open members of the Duma could sell communist literature and so on far more openly than others could in Tsarist rule. So he had to, he had to sell those, he had to actually recruit so many people into the revolutionary party. So he said that, that was a risk we took, and we did not know it. We were fooled. We realized it later. But that did not mean, the takeaway from that is not that we should not have participated in elections, or that electoral battle itself did this to us. Okay, so while saying all that, while arguing those things, he was also arguing something else in left-wing communism, which is very important if we want to understand the the subsequent decline and demise of the Soviet Union. So this, people tend to read these in terms of individuals. They tend to, if they criticize China today, it will be by criticizing Xi. If they criticize Russia, it will be by saying, oh, Stalin was the mistake, or Khrushchev was the mistake, or whatever it is. So they will identify the mistakes with certain individuals. Instead, I would say that reading left-wing communism is quite interesting there, because Lenin is actually pointing out to the fact that petty production, small production, that is very widespread in Russia even after the revolution, and that is going to engender capitalism on a daily basis. It is going to create a bourgeoisie and a petty bourgeoisie on a daily, hourly basis on a mass scale. And that is what lays the foundations for the bureaucratism that we finally we saw in later times grow and grow and grow in the Soviet Union, and overturn so many of the gains of the of the Russian Revolution. So that means that you have to fight that. It's not easy to fight that, which means that you cannot fight it simply by killing off certain people or locking up certain people whom you think of as being anti-revolutionary in the gulags or the jails, or executing them or whatever. That is not going to help you. That will not help you fight this revolution. It will not help you safeguard your revolution. So what he's saying here is precisely that the revolution is, the anti-revolutionary ideas are not embedded in certain human beings whom you can get rid of and say, okay, now my revolution will be safe because that guy is gone. In fact, he said it's coming very quietly on this daily basis, and it happens even before you know it. So in a way, like we face these struggles even in our trade union movements today, where you may be a very good trade union leader, but the very fact that it is more difficult for workers to participate in daily democratic decisions, which they should if the trade union is to remain democratic and revolutionary, right? But it's so much easier to allow the good leader to take all the decisions. It's so much easier to cede that decision making to some bunch of good leaders, and gradually, that's where that that bureaucracy gradually then develops, right? So that is what, imagine that happening on such a large scale all over Russia. So this is what Lenin was in a way talking about and pointing to, and that is what we will have to guard against. If we, to safeguard any revolution, be so alert against it daily, hourly, every minute, all the time, and that is what is so hard. I think that was basically the size and the size of what I said. There were some questions which had come up, which were about there was one question about China. I think it was about what is our assessment. So I had said the same thing which I said here, that when you see we criticize China as we did Soviet Russia, China today and Soviet Russia earlier, from a leftist vantage point. Those who try to brand China as villainous and spread all kinds of racist nonsense about China, from a right wing point of view, they attack China. They are actually the ones who are perfectly happy with all the things China is doing today that we are actually criticizing, which means that China's treatment of its national minority Uyghur people, the Uyghur Muslims, of its treatment of them, it's locking them up into so-called re-education camps. Well, Modi would be very happy to do that. He would be very happy to borrow all the surveillance mechanisms that China uses against its citizens, the censorship on social media that the Chinese state does. Modi would absolutely love to do that. Trump would love to do that. So, all these things are basically the things we criticize China for as leftists, the Chinese state today for as leftists. And I want to tell you that there are Chinese, the Chinese working class today. It's not just about social, issues, the issues of Muslim minorities or whatever. It's also even about the workers. Workers, you see, what is happening in China is that it's a socialism is a transitional phase between capitalism and communism. So the point is that in a backward country like Soviet Russia was, or like China was, what you do is that they have had to do is to bring in they've done a socialist revolution, and then they are trying to develop capitalism under a socialist leadership, right? And that has its problems, because you are doing it saying that only the development of an industrial working class on that scale is actually going to unleash the forces that can make socialism a viable, that can make a communist state a viable possibility one day. So we are working towards that, right? But the problem there is that, which China, it's very visible in China now, that you are allowing the more and more power that you're allowing capitalists in your under state control. State control is not what defines whether something is going to remain socialist in spirit or not. The very fact that your working class is not allowed to have its own independent unions, that they must be only in state-led unions, that itself means that what is happening, the working class, which is supposed to be that force, the revolutionary force, if you are not allowing it to to have independent unions, of course, if you're declaring that only the state-led unions are the revolutionary ones, that is not particularly revolutionary. Likewise, if Marxist study circle in Beijing University, if Marxist students go and try to join the workers and help them form independent unions, and you lock up those students and throw away the key, calling them seditious and so on and so forth, how is that revolutionary? It is the same Beijing University where Mao learned to be Marxist, learned to be a revolutionary, and today you are stopping Marxist students from doing that. So this is what we are criticizing China for, and we do it from a leftist vantage point, just as we also criticized, my party criticized the Soviet Union pretty early on from a leftist vantage point. And somebody else had said, oh, Lenin is a mass murderer. And I had said, no, in fact, it was the Tsarist rule that was a mass murderer and was killing people on a mass scale. The Russian Revolution was in no way a murderous revolution. It was a revolution which was primarily a democratic one, and in fact, with surprisingly very small amount of bloodshed, in fact, and as I showed you, it was the people's will that was playing out there. Even the making of the Russian Constitution happened with not some expert sitting in a room and making the Constitution, but you read the process of that, and you had workers, delegations of different sections of workers and women and peasants and soldiers and so on, coming in and saying, hey, change this, change that, put this in, put that out, delete this, delete that. So they were the experts. They were the ones who were writing their own constitution. So this was something basically to understand about revolutionary Russia. I think that was more or less what I said. Somebody had asked me a question about saying that, look, Lenin's right to self-determination, that is what we are upholding when we support the Assam NRC. So I had just said there that look, actually, the right to self-determination, absolutely, in terms of defending your language, in terms of defending Assamese language, Assamese culture, totally, that would certainly fit in with the right to self-determination. But the issue here is that those on the left, and especially those who understand Lenin, should also have a criticism of the state. How can you say that the way to do that preservation of one's culture and language and so on is going to come by giving such a unlimited power to the state, that to a state during a fascist, when a fascist power is ruling the regime, when the courts and so on are not at their not at all at their democratic best right now. Um, uh, at that time, to give the ruling class and the state, their state, this power to decide citizenship based on documents and so on, who is that going to hurt? Lenin also said, he didn't just say right to self-determination. He said, he and Marx said, workers of the world unite. They said they were agreed on the fact the workers don't have a nationality, that they don't have a nation. So how do you square the idea that workers may love a certain language or culture, of their nationality, and yet the fact that you're saying they have no nation? How do you square those two things? Well, you square them by realizing that the democratic urge to preserve your language and your specifics of your culture and so on, that's fine. But the point is that if you're going to treat workers from another, say even from a neighboring, even if you assume that they are from a neighboring country, which of course most of those left out of the Assam NRC are not. But the point is, even if you assume that they are, you can't see them as being infiltrators and whatnot. They are simply poor people who don't see borders when they go in search of somewhere to earn. Right now, Bangladesh's economy is doing pretty much better than India's, and there are bound to be lots of poor people going from India across the border over to Bangladesh as well. That's going to happen, So the point is that how can anybody on the left actually look at the poor workers, as being a hegemonic force, as being this hegemonic, trying to impose some kind of hegemonic culture on the Assamese people? I don't think that could be the way. The way to preserve Assamese culture and Assamese language, probably the way to, we'd have to look for a way to do it in a way that does not give these draconian powers to the state to oppress, poor people. And the simple fact is that now, it's not a question of whether you thought this was needed or not. I won't go into that argument. But right now we have the results of the NRC in front of us. And we know that 70% of those left out of that Assam NRC, nearly 20 lakh people, 70% of them are women. What are we saying? Are we really supposed to believe that women alone came across the borders and were infiltrators or something like that, or illegal immigrants or whatever it is? That's highly unlikely. That is not true. It's simply that they are poor people, and especially poor women who could not show documentation, and that's about it, right? So I think all I'm saying is I'm just saying that when we reread Lenin right now, let's read it with probably less, let's not assume that maybe we already know. Let's not pick and choose over there. Let's try and read it holistically and apply it to the problem which you're facing now, which is the question of nationality in Assam, and or in other parts of the northeast of India, or in other parts of the world, and try and see what you can learn from it in terms of looking at it as how to find a democratic solution for it rather than a state-led solution for the problem, right? So I think that was the okay. Somebody is saying, if you like, not Lenin, yaar, it's Lenin. Kamal Gaurav Pandey, at least learn to spell his name. If you like Lenin and Hitler, by who liked Hitler? Do you know who liked Hitler? Golwalkar loved Hitler. RSS loved Hitler. RSS loves Hitler even now. Hedgevar, their founders loved Hitler. They wrote paeans to Hitler. When Bhagat Singh was reading Lenin, these guys were, and when Rabindranath Tagore was visiting Russia and learning about Lenin, these chaps were learning about Hitler and Mussolini and trying to learn about Hitler. So, no, actually we don't support Hitler, and Hitler's regime came down in very large part because Soviet Russia sacrificed so much to fight against the fascist Hitler's regime. Okay, so you're saying liking Lenin and liking Hitler are two completely different things, and you're saying if you like Lenin and Hitler, then Modi ji is the best choice for India. Actually not, all right, because Modi ji is actually the Hitler Bhakt who wants to wipe out nationality, wipe out minorities in India, just as Hitler wanted to wipe out the Jewish minorities in his regime there. That's practically the exact opposite of what Lenin would stand for and what revolutionary communism would stand for. Basically that's what I said in the Hindi one also, and somebody's asked the similar question in English, so I've basically added that as well. Okay, so thank you. I'll stop now.